Okay, welcome, Healthy Lifestyles participants, to our workshop today. Um, we have a great workshop planned with Katie Newbern from Friends of Great Salt Lake. Um, as you can see up on the screen, there's a little prompt to share in the chat a word or memory that you associate with the Great Salt Lake. So go ahead and do that as I read a little introduction paragraph about her and about her organization. So Friends of Great Salt Lake is a membership-based nonprofit organization founded in 1994 with the mission to preserve and protect the Great Salt Lake ecosystem and to increase public awareness and appreciation of the lake through education, research, advocacy, and the arts. The long-term vision of Friends is to achieve comprehensive watershed-based restoration and protection for the Great Salt Lake ecosystem. Great Salt Lake's 22,000 square mile watershed connects more than 2.5 million people who affect and are affected by the lake's ecosystem. As the director of Friends Education and Outreach Program, Katie Newbern seeks to help this population appreciate their ecosystem and take action to protect it. I'm so excited to have Katie here. I'm gonna let her take the time. We want this to be really interactive, so I'll be monitoring the chat. Send your
Uh,
comments into the chat, send your questions into the
oh no,
chat, and
I'm
then
not.
I
I'm.
will
It's like a.
relay those to her.
Never mind. It's good.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and
Yeah.
thanks to the whole Salt Lake County Wellness team for inviting me to speak with you all today. I was telling Hannah, I really appreciate the recognition that Great Salt Lake and the health of our environment more broadly is just so critical to our health and wellness. And I'm really excited to kind of give you an overview of Great Salt Lake's values, the causes and consequences of its decline, a little bit of an update about the status of the lake since our historic snowpack over this last winter, and efforts that we can support to restore the lake to a healthy elevation. So just to tell you a little bit before we get too deep into that, a little more of an overview about Friends of Great Salt Lake. Um, Friends, like Hannah mentioned, is a membership-based nonprofit founded almost 30 years ago in response to declining lake levels driven by overconsumption upstream. So this story of Great Salt Lake's decline has been ongoing basically since the first diversion of City Creek for irrigated agriculture when the pioneers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. Our, water that we all consume in this watershed would all naturally be going to Great Salt Lake. And so our organization works to help the public understand that connection of our own actions to this ecosystem and promote appreciation for this ecosystem so that we all feel more inspired to take care of it and preserve it for the future. We have programs focused on education, research, advocacy, and the arts, all working to support that mission. I get to teach our fourth grade field trip program. It's funny, somebody mentioned that that was one of their memories of the lake. It is such a joy to me to get to introduce students to the lake and help them get to know their ecosystem better. And then we also have research scholarship programs that help promote our understanding of the lake at the undergraduate and graduate student level. We organize an annual forum that brings together experts from all different fields to share their work and our best, current understanding of the lake at our biennial Great Salt Lake Issues Forum. That's every other year. The next one is coming up in May. We also have this really fabulous arts program that kind of curates a show of artwork from all different mediums inspired by the lake each year. And that event is coming up in September. And so we think it's really important to recognize the cultural significance that Great Salt Lake has had in Utah and around the world, and also recognize that art is a form of advocacy and helps us understand Great Salt Lake in a different way than even science can. So we love supporting artists who have, this deep connection to the lake as well. And we also are engaged in a variety of advocacy efforts on the lake's behalf. Sometimes this looks like legal real challenges, especially related to land use issues around the lake. We recently argued before the Utah Court of Appeals in regard to a landfill that was constructed on the shore of the lake. So that's kind of a snapshot of the programs that support our mission. But overall, again, we work to help the public better understand and appreciate the lake and promote policy that can deliver more water to this ecosystem that really needs it lately. And Great Salt Lake's ecosystem is super unique. We'll talk more about that, but um, here's a picture or a map showing our watershed. It's huge. It's basically all of northern Utah. It's 22,000 square miles, and all of the water that rains or snows within this huge area would naturally flow to or toward Great Salt Lake. Great Salt Lake is the lowest point of this whole huge area, and there's three major rivers that bring water into Great Salt Lake, primarily from the Wasatch Mountains here on the east side um, of Great Salt Lakes Basin. So we have the Bear River coming in from the north into Bear River Bay here. We have the Weber River coming in from kind of the central Wasatch. And then we have the Jordan River that flows north from Utah Lake into Great Salt Lake. Here in Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County, we are part of primarily the Jordan River Basin. And it's important to note that there are no rivers flowing out of Great Salt Lake. Again, because it's at the lowest point of this basin, no rivers can flow uphill to leave it. And that is why Great Salt Lake is salty. The minerals that flow into the lake in trace amounts from all of these rivers collect here at the bottom of the basin, and the water is able to evaporate up out of the lake, and oftentimes will condense into clouds and precipitate back down in our mountains as lake effect snow. But all of those minerals and even pollution that enters the lake through these tributaries has no way of leaving. It's unable to evaporate. So the minerals collect. That's why the lake is salty. And that's also why it's really important that we keep our whole watershed clean and free of pollution, so that pollutants don't enter this system, because once it's there, there's really no way for it to leave. And as we'll talk about more, as the lake has receded away from this historic average shoreline, we breathe back in some of those pollutants in the form of dust that blows off of the exposed lake bed. So that's a little bit of like Great Salt Lake 101. Um, and to just touch briefly on the values of Great Salt Lake's really unique ecosystem, I could go on and on about this forever, but Great Salt Lake is super important, especially for migratory birds. The lake can support up to 10 million migratory birds each year from over 300 different species. So that's a huge quantity and variety of bird life that is depending on the food web that Great Salt Lake provides. This is one bird that kind of highlights that food web. This is the eared grebe. And these cute birds, we can have up to 5 million of them visiting Great Salt Lake each year. They feast on brine shrimp while they're here. They primarily visit the lake in the fall when they're staging before they fly south for the winter. And while they're here, each bird will eat up to 30,000 brine shrimp per day, which is just a huge amount of food. They will double their body weight. And while they're here, they also molt their flight feathers and regrow them. So that makes them really vulnerable during the fall while they're kind of trapped here, fueling up and getting ready to fly again south for the winter. They fly and travel in such huge flocks that this is what they look like on radar, weather and airplane radar scanners. They look like a giant storm cloud leaving the lake. And this is just, again, one of the over 300 species of unique birds that each have their own story and relationship with Great Salt Lake. Great Salt Lake, in addition to its ecological value, which again, there's many more values, snow, wetlands, and water purification and storage. I could go on and on, but in addition to all of those environmental values, the lake also contributes to our economy, contributing upwards of $1.3 billion each year to Utah's annual GDP, most of that coming from the mineral extraction industry. These are huge piles of salt that are harvested from Great Salt Lake using primarily evaporation to distill the brine, concentrate the brine before it's processed into not only salt, but other kinds of minerals as well, including lithium is a mineral that is newly being produced out of Great Salt Lake, which has really promising economic potential as there's growing demand for renewable energy storage. And we also have this brine shrimp harvesting industry. So the industry actually harvests the brine shrimp eggs, which float like these huge slicks on the surface of the water. And these eggs are dried and then shipped overseas to mainly countries in Asia, where they're used, they're hatched and then used as food for farmed fish and shrimp. And about half of the fish and shrimp that's imported in the United States is raised using brine shrimp harvested from Great Salt Lake. So this is contributing to our food supply, our aquaculture industry, and believe it or not, brine shrimp are a multi-million-dollar industry. And this is a good example of an industry that is pretty sustainably managed. The state has biologists that go and monitor the brine shrimp population and decide how many eggs can be harvested, how many pounds. It's actually like tons of eggs can be harvested from the lake so that it's done in a sustainable manner, leaving enough for the birds that need to eat all those brine shrimp. So the lake's immense ecological and economical values are both threatened as the lake continues to shrink. So since its historic high in the mid 1980s, Great Salt Lake has lost more than half of its surface area. And you can see in this image just how dramatic that decline really has been. And it's pretty wild to me to think that just in 40 years, the lake has changed so much. This picture also gives us a good image of how much of the lake bed has been exposed around the shoreline of the lake, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment too. But here's another image showing Great Salt Lake's decline since its high in the 80s. Just last year in November, the lake reached an all-time historic record low, and things were quite dire. Not only did the lake reach this low elevation and historic, smallest surface area. But as the lake's been getting smaller, its salinity is also concentrating. Again, that salt is not able to evaporate along with the water. So the same volume of salt is being concentrated in a smaller and smaller volume of water. And that poses some pretty serious threats to the food web within primarily this south arm of the lake, this southern half. You can see this color change, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. But the concentrating salinity is one of the most imminent threats for the ecosystem that the lake supports. And the exposure of this lake bed around the shoreline of the lake is one of the most imminent threats for all of us humans that live around Great Salt Lake. We're already seeing impacts to the wildlife that depends on Great Salt Lake. Just this month, state biologists and scientists from the University of Utah and Westminster's Great Salt Lake Institute were going out to Gunnison Island, which is in the north arm of Great Salt Lake and has historically been home to one of the largest colony of breeding American white pelicans for hundreds of years. And when they went out there to go and monitor the population this year and do some banding, they discovered that there were almost no pelicans there this year. There had been a few that they'd seen on the cameras, but significantly smaller populations that were there to nest. And then when they returned to go and attempt to do some banding, they discovered that most of the nests, almost all of them, had been abandoned this year. And they suspect that this is kind of a delayed response to this ongoing issue of water level decline, which is making islands like Great Salt Lake accessible to predators. Like coyotes, foxes, land mammals, as well as disturbance by humans, scientists that are increasingly concerned about monitoring these bird populations. So even in light of this big winter that we received this year, it's important to recognize that, sometimes it takes our ecosystems, there's kind of a delayed effect, right, from declining lake levels and rising salinity. And we are also experiencing impacts from the exposed lake bed. This is a weather camera at the University of Utah that captured this dust storm coming in from the lake bed directly into Salt Lake City. I mean, it's just crazy to see this population engulfed in dust. Horrible, right? And I've seen it. I was up there, I was up on Ensign Peak, if anybody know where that knows where that is, just this summer with, one of my summer camp groups, and we could just see and feel like our faces were, like, gritty with dust that had come in, maybe not only from Great Salt Lake, potentially from other sources of dust pollution in the valley and potentially even in the West Desert, way even further than Great Salt Lake, but all of this really can impact our quality of life and the quality of our health for the 2.5 million people that live in not only the watershed, but the airshed surrounding Great Salt Lake. This is one very recent study that was conducted in populations living near Lake Urmia, which is a saline lake in Iran. And this study found linkages between the proximity of populations to the exposed lake bed around Lake Urmia, which is experiencing a very similar decline as Great Salt Lake, and increased frequency of high blood pressure, especially in women. So this was a study conducted in adults, and that was the most that was like kind of the biggest finding was increased cases of hypertension, but there were other like health impacts that they were seeing in higher frequency the closer people were living to the exposed lake bed, and the especially those groups living in the downwind direction from that exposed lake bed. I was just reading another study from 2019 looking at populations of children primarily around the Salton Sea in Southern California, and that study found much significantly higher cases of asthma and respiratory symptoms in those children living around Salton Sea compared to communities elsewhere. So, this is kind of a small but growing body of research, these health impacts for communities that live around these shrinking saline lakes. Saline lakes around the world are all experiencing similar impacts from overconsumption of water from growing populations upstream of them. And I think we will continue to hear more kind of scary, alarming findings about our exposure to these dust events on our health. Um, Thankfully, so that was a lot of doom and gloom. We're not quite done just yet, but we did have a really kind of miraculous winter this year that truly pulled the lake back from the brink of ecological collapse. At the record low in November, Great Salt Lake's salinity in the South Arm reached a point, kind of reached, barely surpassed the threshold that the brine shrimp and brine fly populations in the lake can survive. So that was a really imminent threat to those two keystone species that provide food sources for the millions of birds that visit the lake. And at that record low level, marinas were not operational, beaches were not accessible. There was the mineral extraction industry and the brine shrimp industries were all really severely impacted. It was quite dire. So this miraculous snowpack that we received kind of caught, I think, a lot of climatologists, a lot of folks in our water resources departments at the state level by surprise. Nobody was really expecting that we would have this kind of relief from the drought, even if it was just kind of a one-off year. But in light of that snowpack that we started receiving over the winter, the state made the decision to raise the berm of this railroad causeway that divides Great Salt Lake into its north arm up here and its south arm. So the south arm of Great Salt Lake is really where the ecosystem is. Down here is where Great Salt Lake State Park and the marina is. Here's Antelope Island. So this is where the Bear River, Weber River, and Jordan Rivers come into Great Salt Lake, and this is what captures all of the freshwater inflows for the most part, other than direct precipitation. So there's this railroad causeway that cuts off the north arm from all of that freshwater flowing in, and as a result, the north arm of Great Salt Lake is about twice as salty as the south arm. That's why we can sometimes see this different color in the north arm. It'll it'll turn this really cool kind of pink lemonade color because of the halophilic bacteria that can survive there. Pretty much nothing else can live in this hypersaline water. And then down here is where we have, again, the brine shrimp, algae, brine fly, and microbial populations that support the birds. So there is a breach in this causeway that allows water from the south arm to flow into the north arm, and that's what's kept it full since the railroad causeway was constructed. So it allows this, you know, 10 to 15% saline water from the south arm to flow into the north arm. And there has also been some water because there's kind of like a density gradient from this denser brine in the north arm that also flows into the less dense water in the south arm. There's been basically two-way exchange historically between the north arm and the south arm. But in an effort to try to capture as much of the freshwater runoff from this snowpack in the South Arm to protect the ecosystem. The state made the decision to basically raise this berm up above the level of the South Arm so that that fresh water would stay here until the South Arm salinity was reduced back down to a healthy level for the brine shrimp and brine fly populations. So that is something that was kind of unprecedented, and that's kind of a new variable in the equation of Great Salt Lake's spring runoff season, in which it typically will rise a normal year. The last like few years, the lake would rise maybe 2.5 feet throughout the spring runoff season. And after raising the berm in February, since then the South Arm rose to its peak about almost 5.5 feet. But the North Arm, because it was cut off from those inflows for most of that season, the North Arm rose less than a foot. So I've seen a lot of headlines about, Great Salt Lake rose 5+ feet, 6 feet by some accounts. But I think it's really important to contextualize that that's only half of the lake. And especially when we consider the impact of the exposed lake bed, we do need to be maintaining the elevation of the north arm as well as the south arm. So the average gain for this big winter that we had was about 3.5 feet, 3.6 feet of gain. And we expect the lake, typically throughout the summer and fall, the lake will decline about 2 to 2.5 feet as the water evaporates out in the summer and fall months. So I think, again, it's important that we keep in mind the elevation of the lake as a whole, or maybe its average elevation, and that we don't forsake the North Arm to dry up, even though it is important to preserve the ecosystem of the South Arm, we need to maintain the lake as a whole. So the last couple years, we've seen more progress on the policy front than ever before. We've made some really significant progress on reforming our water policy to suit our, modern and changing climate, the reality of our declining water supply as we face basically aridification in the American West. We are seeing drier, hotter summers. We're seeing less snow and more rain. And have the fastest growing population in the country here in Utah. So all of those variables make it really important that we adapt and learn to live within the means of our natural water supply so that we can meet the needs not only of our growing population, but also of the natural environments and ecosystem whose health we depend on, whose health is directly tied with our own health. So this is some of the kind of headline policy reform that has been accomplished in the last couple of years. 2022 in our Utah State Legislature was considered a watershed year, pardon the pun, but a really really impactful year for water policy. The legislature created the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust and funded that initially with $40 million to start acquiring water rights, purchasing, leasing water rights to hold on behalf of Great Salt Lake. And that is exactly how we are going to be able to ensure that we have enough water reaching Great Salt Lake each year to offset the water that's evaporating out. And then HB 33 was also passed in 2022. And that a lot of folks will refer to Utah having had this use it or lose it water policy, specifically, oftentimes in relation to agricultural water rights. So, farmers historically did have this issue where they had no incentive to conserve because if they did not utilize their full water right, they risked, after a few consecutive years not using that full right, losing the right to the portion that they weren't using. HB 33 kind of resolved that issue where now farmers have the ability to lease the portion of their water right that they are either saving or that they don't need to use or they don't want to use for whatever reason. They can lease that portion of their water right to the state to remain in stream rather than being diverted so that that water can go to Great Salt Lake and they can even be compensated for it, as an additional source of income, which is great. And that's kind of an ongoing effort. There's a lot of work still to be done in kind of building trust with the agricultural community and listening to their needs and, ensuring that they don't feel like they are being stripped of their water rights, but rather inviting them to be, a partner in this work of allocating more water to Great Salt Lake. 2023, we saw some great projects funded. I think that was kind of a highlight of this most recent state legislative session. We saw additional funding for agricultural water optimization. Those are basically subsidies to help farmers become more water efficient in their irrigation so that they can grow the same yield using a smaller amount of water, lease the difference of what the water that's saved to remain in stream and go to Great Salt Lake. That's a program that we definitely want to see continuing to be supported, continuing to be utilized by the agricultural community. And we want to see more water that had been used for agriculture reaching Great Salt Lake. The state also purchased an area of wetlands on the southeastern shore of Great Salt Lake. And we have a lot of development that happens that kind of is encroaching on the eastern and southern shoreline of Great Salt Lake. And that's where we have some of the most critical wetlands. And wetlands are this super rich biodiverse habitat that are utilized by most of the birds that are visiting Great Salt Lake. So preserving those wetlands and kind of preventing endless development in those areas is really critical. So it's great that we have growing support at our both state and local levels for the preservation of those areas. Salt Lake City in its most recent budget also set aside some funding to look into preservation of the shoreline area within Salt Lake City's boundary as we have development going on there related to like the Utah Inland Port. The new Utah State Prison is out there. There's just always, hunger and demand for development and land. And we also need to keep in mind the ecological value that those areas are providing and protect that too. The state has also been making progress on kind of supporting the cultural transformation of how we our landscaping in northern Utah. Landscaping and outdoor water use is the largest portion of our municipal water use, and so becoming more water efficient in our landscaping is going to be a really key piece of opening up more water within that piece of the pie to reduce demand, reduce how much water we are projecting is needed for our growing population, preventing the need for new water development and diversion, building new dams along those three rivers that flow into Great Salt Lake, new reservoirs. We want to try to stretch our existing supply as far as we can by becoming as water efficient as we can be in our outdoor irrigation for landscaping. The state, there's also so much work to be done in improving our measurement and monitoring data collection about how we are diverting and consuming water across the watershed. There's a great saying, you can't manage what you can't measure. And that is so true for us here as we face all of these, pressures on our water supply and investing in better instruments and monitoring staff to run data analysis about how our water is being used, where it's going, where we have room to conserve. That's going to really pay off for us in the long run. So we definitely like to see investment in monitoring and measurement. And we've also seen progress over just the last couple years on secondary water metering. This is not so much an issue in Salt Lake County, but especially in like Davis County, Weber County, Cache County, northern Utah areas. The water that's used for outdoor irrigation in those areas is often what's called secondary water, which is basically former agricultural canals that were covered, piped, and now run into people's yards. And in most of those areas, that water has no meters on it at all. So people pay a really low flat rate for that outdoor water. And the state, this was a 2022 bill actually decided that by, I think it's 2030, all secondary water will be metered, and that will pave the way for potentially usage-based rates for that outdoor irrigation. We are the second driest state in the country, and so we really do need to be treating water like the precious resource that it is. And I think paying a fair rate for based on our usage is a good approach to promote, to kind of incentivize conservation in that market-based way. Um, those are, I think, some of the biggest highlights from funding from 2023. Another big step that the state took this last legislative session was the creation of a new position called the Great Salt Lake Commissioner, also referred to by some media groups as the Great Salt Lake Czar. And that position will have some authority over the other state agencies like the State Department of Natural Resources, the State Division of Water Resources, to kind of have a voice for Great Salt Lake represented in discussions about our resources, and potentially having even authority like veto power over some decisions being made by those agencies in the interests of Great Salt Lake. But ideally, we want to see this position being somebody who promotes coordination among those agencies, brings all the stakeholders together at the table. Especially, I think, again, there's a lot of work to still be done in bringing the agricultural community to the table to participate in these conversations. And we expect a strategic plan from our new Great Salt Lake Commissioner. His name is Brian Steed, by the end of this year. So it will be really exciting to see kind of what manifests from that new leadership as representing the interests of Great Salt Lake. And then something that was super encouraging to me, and I think a lot of folks working on this issue, was to see the first donation, a significant donation of water to the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust. I think this was back over in like the early spring. The LDS Church donated 20,000 acre feet of water per year in perpetuity to the trust to flow to Great Salt Lake going forward. And that water had been used for agriculture historically. The church is a huge water rights holder in northern Utah. And it's really encouraging to see, the church stepping up as a leader and as an example, saying, this is water that we can do without, and recognizing the need of Great Salt Lake. And this is exactly what the restoration of Great Salt Lake is going to look like, is continued donations and acquisition of water by the trust to reach the additional amount of water that's needed each year, which is about a little over 100 million acre, or excuse me, 1 million acre feet of water per year to restore the lake, or basically balance out the water that's been lost each year by evaporation. So we love to see, leaders stepping up and participating in the trust. We hope to see a lot more of that going forward. But these are some of the big, like, kind of systemic levers that we're starting to pull to carve out water within our finite supply to support Great Salt Lake. And kind of what remains on the to-do list from the perspective of our organization, these are a few of our kind of policy platforms at the moment, is to consider the role of the mineral extraction industry in the consumptive water use in our watershed. The mineral extraction industry uses the same amount of water as all of the municipal and industrial water use in the watershed. So that's each about 13% of the total consumptive use in the basin. And for what they're using, that 13%, they could actually be using about 3 times as much water as how much they have rights to use. So while all of us are being asked, and making the effort to conserve, kind of making sacrifices on behalf of the lake, we feel that the mineral extraction industry needs to be considering their role in conservation as well. Um, you may have heard that during this last legislative session, there had been a resolution introduced to establish a target elevation range for Great Salt Lake. And that resolution unfortunately failed this year. There was some pushback about kind of prioritizing or recognizing the water needs of Great Salt Lake over other needs. However, we feel like, without a goal, without an official recognized target that we should be working toward, it's hard to quantify, how much conservation is really needed. So by establishing this elevation range, we can then kind of calculate backwards the quantity of water that's needed, and we can measure our progress against those goals. We would really like to see the state officially recognize the healthy elevation range that we already know supports the many beneficial uses of Great Salt Lake, including its economic uses. So we want to, be meeting all of the needs or all of the benefits of the lake's ecosystem by restoring the lake to that healthy range. And again, I mentioned that, as we have this growing population, there's continually discussion about new water diversion and development. The reason that we are able to support our huge population in northern Utah is our system of dams and reservoirs, water storage that has basically been like a credit line of, taking water that would have gone to Great Salt Lake, storing it upstream so that we have it available for our use, all the different ways that we use water. And that's good that we have water security. I mean, last year when Great Salt Lake had reached its record low, and we didn't know that we would have this huge winter, it was pretty alarming to see all of our reservoirs reaching record low levels, and really kind of facing these questions about the future of our water supply in northern Utah. And conservation is really the key to stretching that supply as far as we possibly can, without further kind of cannibalizing our own supply that is reaching our and supporting our natural ecosystems. One such project that's been on the table is the Bear River Development Project. Some portion, I think it's 1/16 of Utah's sales tax, goes to support the funding for these future projects. And we would like to see the state officially kind of abandon the plan to divert more water from the Bear River, which is Great Salt Lake's largest tributary, and really go all in on conservation. We have plenty of water. It's a matter of prioritizing how we use and consume that water, and further development, further diversion along the Bear River could easily be like the final nail in Great Salt Lake's coffin. So we'd really like to see the state move away from plans to meet our future water demand, the projected demand, through additional diversion, and instead focus on conservation. And what can all of us do as individuals, right, residents in this area, to support those efforts, both at the systemic level, I mean, advocacy is so important, being engaged in, during the state legislative session, contacting our elected and appointed leaders, following the bills that are being introduced, holding them accountable for addressing statewide, systemic issues like this is really critical. But all of us that live in the Great Salt Lake watershed are also water users ourselves. So we each have a role to play in this as well. And again, kind of the name of the game is learning to live within the means of our natural water supply. We've been over consuming our storage, our water that's been stored in our reservoirs has allowed us to live beyond our means. And now it's time that we adapt our habits so that enough water remains to keep Great Salt Lake at a healthy level, restore it to a healthy level, and maintain that level. So just add water, right? It's so simple. Unfortunately, it's a little more complicated than that. Here's a picture of what our consumptive water use looks like in our watershed. You can see it's pretty glaring, right? 2/3 of that water almost is being used for irrigated agriculture. Most of that agriculture is alfalfa production. So that is, an important crop in our global food supply, feeding our food, right? Feeding especially beef and other kinds of animals that are raised for meat and our food supply. So the water that's being applied for agriculture is, it has benefits. It's not being wasted, but again, as the second driest state in the country, I think it's valid to be critical of how much water we're allocating for that single use. It's tricky also because those farms, most of them have these super, super historic, long-standing water rights. So getting them, we need to provide incentives on this kind of voluntary basis for them to participate in conservation. Um, we can see also in this pie chart that, mineral extraction is tied with municipal and industrial water use. Um, that's all of us. Municipal is, all of our cities and residential water use in the basin. So mineral extraction can definitely play a big role in conservation as well. I noticed somebody just mentioned in the chat the majority of alfalfa grown in Utah goes to China, and I it is a significant portion. It's about 30%, which is very significant, right? So, but I think need to. There's a lot of like it's a little controversial. It's a little heated, right? How we discuss agriculture. And I think there's a lot of like, it's easy to point fingers and it's easy to look at this pie chart and say, okay, well, here's where we have the most opportunity to send water to Great Salt Lake. That's 2/3 of the water. We need to send a significant portion of that to the lake, and that's true. However, I think we each type of water user here needs to consider our own role in promoting conservation and to drill down a little bit into that municipal piece of the pie. These are figures from Sandy City. I had pulled these up for a different presentation, but these are pretty representative of most municipalities that don't have a significant, agricultural component in their water consumption. And we can see here that 2/3 more is of our residential water use is used outdoors. About 90% of our indoor water use actually goes back to Great Salt Lake, right? It goes down our drains, it gets treated and discharged into one of the tributaries that flows into Great Salt Lake. And that treated wastewater is one of Great Salt Lake's largest sources of water. So even though it's important that we're efficient in our indoor water use because we want to, reduce the projected future demand that is making projects like the Bear River development seem necessary. The best way that we can all contribute to conservation in this basin is by reducing our outdoor water use. So that's primarily our sprinklers that are set on timers that run once a day, maybe twice a day. Maybe they're running during the hottest part of the day, or they're running into the sidewalk or the road, or maybe they're broken. Maybe, they're watering a thirsty lawn instead of water-wise plants. Those are all some examples of ways that each of us have the power to reduce this huge piece of the pie and keep that water in our reservoirs and stretch that supply further. The state did launch this new statewide turf buyback program just this spring. This had been available for some of the water districts, but not all of them. And now this is available for municipalities that have adopted this specific set of water efficiency standards for new construction. These standards, these like ordinances that they ask municipalities to adopt are pretty minimal. They're not like, they're very reasonable, but there's a link down here and that will show you the municipalities that have already adopted those efficiency standards. And that's true. Somebody just said the turf buyback doesn't apply if you've already started converting your yard. I think it'd be great if we could change that. I totally agree. I think we should all be incentivized to have water-wise landscaping for sure, but you can look more into this program here. A lot of municipalities in Salt Lake County have already adopted these standards. If you see that your municipality has not yet adopted these standards, like for example, I live in South Salt Lake, and I think that I've heard that they are working on it, but I've been like emailing my city council about, progress on adopting those standards so that this program is available to residents in my area. We, would love to see communities participating in these kinds of programs, kind of participating in the cultural transformation that treats our water like the precious resource that it is. All lawns are not the enemy, but lawns that are not being utilized, that are just cosmetic, are not really reasonable for our climate. And, even compared to the use of water for agriculture, at least the water that's being used for alfalfa farming is having some benefits for our food supply rather than a lawn that is sitting, on a parking strip offering benefits to nobody. And these water-wise landscaping plans can be super beneficial for native pollinators, wildlife. There's a lot of benefits to kind of this visible transformation of our, water conservation efforts. So we'd love to see folks participating in this. I think that's my last slide. But again, I'll just say that, again, focusing on what we can do, kind of walking the walk within our spheres of influence in our homes, yards, neighborhoods, cities, and statewide. We have a lot of power to promote conservation and promote the restoration of Great Salt Lake by adapting to the reality of our water supply. And I think this is a problem that's been cultivated over decades of human action, and therefore we each have the ability, humans have the power to also be a part of the solution. And there's a lot of things we can do. So with our last like 10 minutes or so, I also wanted to add before I close down my slides here, if anybody's excited to get out to the lake, we have this cool event coming up at Antelope Island on Saturday, July 29th. It's the annual Antelope Island Spider Festival. So if you want to come out and celebrate our ecosystem and all of the things that are a part of it, you can come and visit the Western Spotted Orb Weavers. That's what these spiders are. Some of you might have been out to Antelope Island in the summertime. These spiders get pretty big. They're super like docile, pretty much harmless to humans. And they help eat up all those pesky bugs that bother us when we're out at the lake. And they're, this key piece of our food chain. So if you want to come and do some spider crafts, here's some spider presentations. Yeah, the reviews are pretty funny. There's a few of them that we've posted as we've been promoting the event. But the good news is if you like thousands of spiders, this is the event for you. So we'd love to see you there. And here's our information if you're interested in kind of following along with our work. Instagram is a great place to keep up with us. We're on Facebook too. And I mentioned that we are a membership-based organization. The membership program is $30 a year, and that signs you up for like our emails, newsletter, event invitations, advocacy alerts during the state legislative session, and supports our programming. So if you're interested in getting more involved, you can become a member at fogsl.org. I'm going to just stop sharing, and with our last 5 or 10 minutes here, I would love for you all to share in the chat one thing that you can do to take action to support Great Salt Lake, to benefit the lake, or maybe an action that you will commit to doing. And it doesn't have to be something radical, right? It could be going and visiting the lake if you haven't been there in a while. It could be, talking to your neighbor about the lake. It could be, something simple. But I would love to hear your ideas for actions that you can take to contribute to the solution to this big issue. So I'll give you all a minute to share. Or if anybody would like to jump on and unmute, that's great too. Staying up to date on legislative action. I love that, Hannah. It's a lot. I wish that it was easier to follow along with all of those bills. But we will be sending out tracking bills and sending out kind of summaries of the kind of key bills that we follow during the state legislative session. It runs January through March. So you can follow along with those. We share most of them to like our Instagram page too and our website. Or if you want to sign up for our emails, you can do that on the website too. We're already working on converting to less grass and water-wise yard. That's awesome. Changing your watering to drip soaker hoses. That's great. Yeah, those spraying sprinklers, they are not very water efficient. A lot of that kind of mist that comes off of them just immediately evaporates. So drip irrigation is really great for landscaping. Contacting your legislators and those in leadership. I think even now in this off season when they're not in session is a great time to reach out and just let them know that this is a priority to you. So that I think because we've had this big winter, some folks think that we're out of the woods. But as we saw, the lake rose on average 3.5 feet this year, and it'll lose maybe up to 2.5 feet. So by next year, we could be in exactly the same position as we were in November, which was quite dire. We really need to stretch this supply as far as we can and remind our leaders that this is a priority. I love these ideas. I think that it's really encouraging to see folks willing to start at home, start in your own yard, and again, walk the walk, right? I was browsing a little on the Salt Lake County website to see if there's any information about water use and water conservation, and it looks like the county has done a good job of like recognizing the need to conserve, establishing conservation goals, providing tips and resources for residents and departments in the county. So good on all of you. Thank you for being a part of that and promoting that. And onward and upward. We need to kind of continue working in that direction. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts to add? I would love to kind of open this up to hear from all of you. Your gripes, your concerns, your hopes, anything that we haven't touched on or that we have.
Feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself. You're totally fine to unmute.
I appreciate those of you that shared your thoughts during my presentation. I think that you've hit a lot of really key ideas, and I really appreciate seeing all of your ideas of actions that you all can take. I know it feels kind of frustrating, might feel kind of futile sometimes to, um, you know, feel like how much of a difference can any individual really make. But I think e- the collective impact, right, is where we're going to see this issue being addressed, and together we can do this. It's within our reach. So I hope that you'll continue to be tuned in to, the news coverage of the lake and the state of it, and continue doing what you can to promote conservation locally and at the state level.
Yeah,
Great
looks like,
resources. Thank you for sharing those.
yeah, Heather Bueller in the chat is sending some videos from the county about water conservation and creating a backyard ecosystem. So feel free to check those out. And this presentation was amazing, Katie. Thank you so much. I feel
Oh,
like I
thank
learned
you all.
a ton about the Great Salt Lake.
That
I
was a
like,
crash course.
it was
So thanks for
amazing.
hanging in there.
I like that you talked about it with an air of positivity, though. There are things that we can change, bills that we can support to create an impact. So thank you so much. It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you all. And I will send you, Hannah, a copy of these slides too, in case anybody's interested.
Perfect. And then Healthy Lifestyles participants, make sure to fill out the little SurveyMonkey link so you can get your points. And yeah, thank you so much, Katie.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.